So there are a number of questions I just throw out. Are people perfectly rational? Mostly rational, not very rational? Is rationality any does it have anything to tell us about human behavior? Is Homo economicus a good model? In how many situations? In what situations? At what times? Those are a couple of them.
I would say, so you were saying towards the end there that the next stage is sociology. There seems to be a step in between, which is social psychology.
Yeah. Okay.
Which, from what I know from having taught A-level psychology, there's very different approaches in psychology. The behavioral economics takes a behaviorist approach in psychology. Yeah. There's also a cognitive approach to psychology, which looks at what's going on in people's heads, even if they don't act on those thoughts. But then there's also kind of psychodynamic psychology, which looks at why people don't even know why they're acting. The way they're acting is based on things that have happened to them in early childhood and so on. And all of these things seem, like you seem to be, and this seems to be what you're getting at, impossible to build into an economic model. But you can build rules of thumb on them, perhaps. I noticed you mentioned rule utilitarianism and John Stuart Mill. Yeah. John Stuart Mill, of course, did say that we should follow rules of thumb, but also that when those rules of thumb don't seem to be working, we should analyse the situation a little bit more carefully, and maybe. So it's possible that maybe he should have got the Nobel Prize for thinking fast and slow 150 years ago.
Yeah. There's nothing new. Of course, rules of thumb break down. That's the point. What can this tell economics? Can economics break out through any of these psychological schools to a more realistic understanding of how people behave?
Well, possibly only if it abandons the idea that it has precise predictive power.
Okay. So you have rules of thumb, and rules of thumb give you a sense of how people will react to situations, but not a precise prediction. In which case, economics has to abandon its quantitative claims. Am I right? I mean, is that how?
I'm not going to disagree with it.
You're not going to disagree with that. I mean, maybe someone would disagree with it.
So I wouldn't think that economics would necessarily have to abandon all of its quantitative approaches just for its acknowledgement of its of rules of its actually analysis of rules of thumb rather than specific events. I mean, we should also acknowledge, while acknowledging that economists only are able to go on and work with or arrive at rules of thumb, we should also acknowledge that rules of thumbs by themselves are not sufficient to actually provide the insights one needs. As you were saying with
what do you think about
John Stuart Mill, saying once we have to abandon.
Well, a question I would ask is, I mean, obviously you'd be familiar with Nassim Taleb's rule of thumb that you should always be prepared for the times when rules of thumb don't work.
Yeah. I think Nassim Taleb I don't think he believes in radical uncertainty in the way that I think Keynes did, because there is a probability of black swans, but it's a very, very slight probability. Whereas I think Keynes was talking, and Knight were talking about situations where you have no probabilities at all. The probability could be very high, it could be very low. You just don't know what it is. And so that is what poses the problem for behavior, and it's what poses the problem for an economist in trying to predict behavior. I mean, what do we actually assume about the way people make decisions under those sort of circumstances? The answer is we assume that they behave according to conventions of one kind or another. And Keynes actually said once, he said, the bankers prefer to be ruined in a conventional way rather than actually take decisions that might save them from ruin. And that, by that he meant simply that they did what everyone else was doing and what a person in their class of activity would regard as normal to do. And that, I think, is a very good description of how people behave. Now, what you can do with it in terms of economics, I'm not quite sure, but at least what I think economic policy can help do is actually reduce the element of uncertainty in any situation, which causes the volatility of behavior. There's another point, I think, which is important to note. A lot of people would say that, would really develop your point and think of rules of thumb or conventions as expressing some average or almost something more natural, and that what goes wrong is more in the nature of a deviation or a friction. Whereas I don't think that was what Keynes meant at all by conventions or normal. He didn't mean by normal behavior. And I think uncertainty people don't mean by normal behavior what some economists mean when they talk of natural behavior. Some economists think of normal behavior as the natural behavioral tendency which will exert itself over a period of time, and abnormal behavior as something that is confined to the short run and will not last for a long time. I don't think that conventional behavior and rules of thumb fit into that categorization at all. I think they have no real reference to anything except the way human beings take decisions under conditions of uncertainty. In other words, with the epistemology they have.
I feel the defense of the economics profession to the rules of thumb argument would be that following rules of thumb in those ways will still be rational under utility maximizing, because those people obviously, where you can't measure a probability exactly, or you have to put an expected value on a probability, following a rule of thumb would be more rational than investing an awful lot of time, investing an awful lot of effort into deciphering what it is and how to make these choices.
Yeah, so, but then you have to abandon rational expectations theory. Because rational...
No, it still could be rational. It still could be rational in that sense. You still could be maximizing your utility by saying, to find out any more information would be reducing my expected utility from putting that time investment in.
But you're assumed to make efficient use of all available information. That is part of the definition, isn't it? You can't then say, well, it's not worth my time finding out additional information. You're already making use of the information efficiently.
But it will be where the disutility from finding information is greater than the utility gained from finding information.
But you've always, sorry, I agree. I agree with the point you're making, but I still think that would be regarded as irrational by someone who is a hard believer in rational expectations. All that's already been taken care of. Those utilities have all been taken care of. And what rational behavior then assumes that you have all the available information at your disposal in making the decision. If you don't personally, haven't worked it all out, someone has. That is, there's a correct model of the economy. Am I caricaturing? I think I am, probably. But I still feel that's the way it's often taught.
Is it possible that one of the insights from psychology that economics could take is that psychology as a general rule makes observations about humans based on experiments, observations, how different ways that psychologists work, and try to make generalizations, bearing in mind that not all humans will behave that way, and not all humans will act that way, and there will be lots of abnormalities and and abnormal psychology, and humans will do all kinds of crazy things, and they do, and it's brilliant. But what that means is psychology has to work very much with an inductive method. That it can make predictions based on observations, but it can only say how likely they are. And what the model-based neoclassical economics that you may have been caricaturing is trying to do is take something that we can only make inductive judgments about and try to give it deductive power, to say we can be certain about this based on this mathematical equation. And then it turns out that it's wrong, and everyone's surprised.
Right. Okay. Well, why? So what should the method of economics be? To abandon that quest for certainty.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Maybe, yes. Or just to say this is what's likely to happen, or this is what's probable to happen, but we don't know.
Yeah.
Or the whole methodological individualism.
Yeah.
The starting point of your lecture was the existence of this Homo economicus, but the history of political economy didn't start with this theoretical simplification. It started with Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, who were depicting the economy as made up by different social classes. So it was a complex system. Each group, each organization producing, contributing to the overall production in the economy. But even without going back to class-based analysis of economics, I was thinking while you were presenting about what Herbert Simon said when he compared the markets with organizations.
Yeah.
He said that basically the real world is made up of complex big organizations and not a network of points representing markets. And
Right.
within organizations there are certain rules, routines, behaviors which are not explained by the.
You need to treat organizations as actors.
Instead, neoclassical economics is,
only
for instance,
individual.
looking at the firm as one unit, very simple unit,
yeah.
maximizing profits, given
Yeah.
a certain.
Well, exactly. I mean, classes as explanatory units sort of fell out by the end of the 19th century in the mainstream.